Welcome everyone, and especially welcome to you, David Cohen, for a talk on medicating normal. I'm very happy to have you here with me today.
Very happy that I could do this today too.
So just to introduce you, you're a professor and associate dean at the Luskin School, UCLA, and you're a professor in social work, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And you're also an author and a researcher, and you did research on culture and social construction for 20 years. Is that right?
Let's say I've been in the research business as an academic professor for nearly 40 years.
Wow.
While also a practicing what we would call here a clinical social worker. So I've worked with families and individuals as a private counselor. And also I worked as a younger social worker in the in public social welfare systems, hospitals, courts, family agencies. So I have broad practice experience, but mostly research experience on the effects of psychoactive drugs, mainly prescribed drugs, but all psychoactive drugs too.
Yeah, and why I'm asking about the years there, for how long, it's because I think it's interesting. We're going to talk a bit about how we construct ideas and stories and narratives around psychoactive drugs and maybe diagnosis as well. And so why I'm asking for the years, it's because you must have seen a big change throughout this, different concepts changing and stories changing.
Huge changes, yes. I feel privileged to have the time perspective. When I started in this business, in this field, for example, the idea of psychiatric diagnosis or a manual of psychiatric diagnoses, though one existed, was irrelevant for most practice, even by physicians and psychiatrists who worked in the mental health field. It was an afterthought. It didn't really matter. To think that the manual then, this is before DSM-3 in 1980, which changed the world really. There is before DSM-3 and after DSM-3. And it was before DSM-3 in the 1970s. To think that something called a DSM would become a cultural phenomenon, an icon, something even school children could discuss among each other to say, oh, your ADHD symptoms are acting up again, or I'm too bipolar. To think that that could happen in my lifetime, well, I don't know. I never thought of that, that could be possible. So I'm more humble about the possibilities of change in the future, meaning I think none of us know what could happen.
So the big shift was the DSM-3, you would say?
Huge shift. It illustrates the kind of shift that took place, that mental disorders, or what we call mental disorders, could become so banal, so ordinary, so much a topic of everyday conversation, so much a label to pin on yourself, something to claim yourself as in fact an advantage in society or a claim to certain rights that others maybe should not have or do not have. That is a radical shift. And it's almost as if the medicalization, the shift to a language of medicine to construct and speak of ourselves, that is a big shift that I can only see occurred when I look back with hindsight. As it happens, it's very hard to see, but we know that we construct ourselves today in terms that are, as I believe Nicholas Rose discussed, neurochemical. We are neurochemical selves, not deep psychological selves. That's an idea 50 years ago. Today we are acting brains that react to chemical stimuli in our environment.
Yeah. Yeah, and when I wrote to you to connect for this conversation, this interview, I mentioned myself the experience of having been kind of in an environment where when Prozac Nation was publicated and came out in the 90s, where I was young, and it became almost, I don't know, I don't want to use the word movement, but almost, it was kind of an identity shift. I think that was the first time I thought about diagnosis or psychoactive drugs in regards to my identity.
What a deep question or comment you make, because I think that it involves the arrival to youth of licit prescribed psychoactive drugs, Prozac being the example. I think Prozac breached the wall. Prozac arrived in North America at the end of the 70s, 1978, 79. It was already being studied and for marketing. And early 80s is when it hit, and it transformed the conversation because of then also the arrival of the diagnosis depression, which itself found a new way to vanquish, if you will, conquer the ordinary world of our feelings. Whereas we had diagnoses of anxiety, and we had the benzodiazepines and the stimulants before that, widespread prescription, the language of the relationship of the self to these mental defects of some kind, and the ease with which everyone began to discuss depression as me, as something we all have a little bit of, as something that also then, now the arrival, the third wave is the neurochemical language, that just because of a little fluctuation in serotonin, a basic chemical that we need to just survive and live, essential. So little fluctuation, a few little extra molecules might make the difference between you and I, between me as a depressed person and me as an undepressed, normal person. And then the idea of normality itself got changed, because we all have that chemical. We're all vulnerable, all of us. And that was the breach, that now we could speak of something universal that was really a variation that was even too small to measure, because we still haven't measured it. Still doesn't exist, that imbalance, the way it's been presented. So it's not been demonstrated. So in fact, so what I'm saying is your comment suggests what was happening. A wave of prescribed drugs, because all that talk about depression was tied to the arrival of Prozac. The personal narratives changed. It became, it wasn't that you were no longer ill or anything. It was you were better than well. You were more yourself, and all this had no cost. It was free. It was no side effects, no harmful effects. It was, so you see, so everything became accessible to discuss and easy. The question is why? Why now? Why did it happen then? And I'm not sure. I have ideas, but I don't know. We can always add factors and say, oh, here's what contributed to this, and secularization, and loss of meaning, and difficulty raising children, and or the rights of women that emerged as people who were not just there to serve the family, or children who were not just there to serve parents, but individual beings in themselves that deserved attention. And all of this helps to maybe understand better why all these ideas emerged at this time in the late 70s. I could go on talking about why for hours.
Yeah, but if we look at like through the same lens, but today, I mean, what I lived through was in, I don't know, 94, maybe 95. And today, this is just an observation I'm thinking right now when you're talking, is that it's still an identity factor, but it's no longer depression, really, is it? Or Prozac.
Oh, no. Well, there you go. So it's no longer depression and it's no longer Prozac. So we're a society, a very complex society with many specialized parts. Just like any complex system, it has numerous specialized activities and so forth. One of those is the pharmaceutical industry. And so it was in the business of creating markets at that time, as it's always been too. Not its only business, but at some point it realized that it could expand and sustain a very large market of people who would not be considered ill in any traditional sense, but who could be maintained on medications that they would themselves seek. It did that through selling and helping to promote diseases of the mind, like depression. But depression was really big in the 1990s in terms of rediscovering depression, identifying depression, all those depressed people who did not know they were depressed, who, we were seeking them out and finding them out. And we were offering to them finally, we can explain to you why XYZ, why you do this, why you think this way, why you feel this way. It's because of this depression. And so all of that promotion was tied to the drugs. But the drugs, because they were patented, only had a certain amount of time at which the manufacturer could make this, I'm not going to call it an obscene profit, but an extraordinary profit by being the only entity that could market the drug. So Prozac has been marketed. It was marketed for 15, 20 years heavily, and different companies made, especially Eli Lilly, lots of money. And then they had to start the process over again to continue making those types of profits. And that means you have to create another drug, a newer one, and you sell it with another diagnosis. So it's a cycle of, it's important to know that the diagnoses are really more important to the people who market the drugs than to the people who receive them. The diagnoses are marketed in a systematic way. They're much more important than the person who takes the drug. Without a diagnosis, you really couldn't push the idea of the drug. But even that's changing a little bit as the boundaries between the licit drugs and the illicit drugs is now no longer so clear. We are testing psilocybin, hallucinogens, and MDMA, and ketamine is now approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the US as a treatment for depression. Ketamine, when I was growing up, it was something you took and went into a isolation tank to increase that feeling of dissociation. I mean, highly illicit for anyone to really play with. Now it's given as, it's encouraged as a treatment. So all these changes make the promotion of the drugs maybe no longer tied to a specific diagnosis, but tied to a general idea of a neurochemical self rather than a psychological self. A neurochemical self is in where you feel that you construct yourself not as a former idea that we inherit from the Enlightenment, from the 17th and 18th century, maybe, where you're made up of deep psychological forces. Some are unarticulated, they're unconscious, but they're all deep, and that's what you need to understand. Today, the more modern idea is you're open to working with your brain and through your brain. It's a more superficial idea. So you're working through your brain, and you're taking advantages of literally the neurochemical opportunities available in your environment. As you could, I think I'm voicing Nicholas Rose, whose book I did not read, but I believe that is exactly the idea from the reviews I've seen that Rose proposes of this shift. And you could call it a cultural shift.
Yeah, because with that idea also comes, I'm just thinking about what you said now. I haven't read the book either, but I've read other books from him, and he's talking about this, how we construct ourselves also as consuming people, consumers.
Yes.
With that idea in mind.
Yes.
So how could we, for example, here in Sweden, there's a huge success with a book called Brain Strong, like, a strong brain.
Yes.
And so many things tied to that, like how can you be smart by exercising, or by, the whole well-being industry.
Right. Absolutely.
So,
I think that's very important too. And it was, maybe that part has, that us as consumers has grown with the rise of the internet, for reasons we can easily understand, that, of the involved consumer, the active consumer, the informed consumer, who can look at options and then choose among what's offered. And that, I think, came with the internet and the product reviews and the rise of the expert citizen, the lay expert, kind of a contradiction in terms, but it does capture something real that we feel of a person who knows a lot because of their experience, which is now held as a form of knowledge, which was always true. But so the consumer, the choosing consumer, the discerning consumer, but those ideas don't last so long because we soon realize after some time that, there's something else at work. Like, in fact, our choices have all been pre-programmed, and our clicks are so measured now that our conversation and how long we are online and so forth, and all that metadata has already been processed and sent to 18 companies that will resell it to advertisers. So in fact, what we think to be so discerning and individual about us may not be so individual. And that's when you get these shifts where we seek for other ways to then explain what makes us, or our identity, as you use that word, what makes us unique. And so we then latch on to certain ideas that themselves, I think, don't change very much. One of those ideas is the chemical imbalance idea. I think that idea is like an archetype. It's like archetype, meaning like a very resilient idea, image. It's resilient because it's lasted a long time. Why? It gives meaning to people's lives. So the notion of disorder or disease as caused by some imbalance strikes most people as, absolutely. It's an ancient idea. I'm sure it's one of the most ancient ideas to explain why we don't feel good. It's that something is out of, whack. The horizon is not straight. That's imbalance because the horizon is usually pretty straight. When you see that straight horizon, I would say for most people, it's a kind of a plenitude, kind of a peacefulness. And to me, that illustrates that if the horizon is not straight, then then something may be off. Something may be wrong. And that's an ancient idea. So these ideas get recirculated, reformulated, repurposed, renovated. They're the same. And when people suffer and they are given a drug, and then they get better after the drug was taken, the notion that they had a chemical imbalance to begin with is one of very few ideas that explains to them what happened. Something was wrong, they took the drug, the imbalance, something was corrected, and now they're better. It's like a narrative that's so powerful that it doesn't matter if you say, no, logically, lots of things could have happened before you took the drug, while you were on the drug, after, or to explain how you felt because you took it. It doesn't have anything to do with the drug per se. It could be all these other explanations. There are logical explanations and so forth. That doesn't matter. Logic has nothing to do with what we like to believe and what gives us meaning. So that's why I find the chemical imbalance idea and its variants, the circuit is not well, the brain is tired, the brain is scratched, the brain is broken. All these ideas give meaning to people, give meaning to their recovery, to feeling better. The chemical imbalance idea is powerful. And when you support it with pharmaceutical marketing, potential, capital, then you have an idea that is probably one of the strongest ideas on the planet. Stronger than religious ideas, stronger than political ideals. This notion that my imbalance could be fixed by a small activity that no one even has to see. It's just intimate, immediate, simple. That's a powerful idea.
Yeah, wow. It's when you say that, you explain a lot, because I've been talking to other people who's also in the movie, and we all discussed this fact that, this chemical imbalance idea is scientifically no longer on the table since a while back.
Right.
But it's so, as you say, so powerful. It just lives on.
Yes. And yes, I wanted to say, when you say it lives on, it will live on. I began earlier by saying I don't think anyone knows what will happen, but one of the things I believe will happen is this idea will live on in other manifestations. It's just too powerful, too meaningful to let go. It's not a bad idea in itself. It's rooted in human experience, I really believe, but it's marketed so that not only do you have an imbalance, the marketing goes, is that it really explains what's going on with you, and our scientific and technological progress is such that this pill will fix that imbalance you have, even though we've never shown the imbalance. We've never sort of demonstrated it in the case of what we're marketing, which is, say, a remedy for depression. So what is the imbalance for depression? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's the discourse. We know that we just need to latch on to the idea and just build around it, just make it implicit, just suggest it. We don't even have to say it anymore. And that's why we know it's a cultural idea today. It's taken for granted. It's shared. It's transmitted to our children. It's valued. That's culture.
Yeah. So then my question before we round off here, because I could spend all night talking here with you, but I want to honor our time.
A few more minutes, yeah.
Just a few more minutes. when having said all that, and this, for me, almost mind-blowing, how you put this is so clear to me, the powerful idea of imbalance. What happens when we want to withdraw, when we see that the drug failed us?
Well, there you go. Thank you for making that segue, which has been on my mind the whole time, that we could make this practical. I've been privileged to work with people for many years who want to stop taking drugs and to accompany them in that process. Whether I had anything to do with the successes that I observed or not, I'm not sure, I don't know. But I've accompanied many people and have been privy to how they rationalized or thought or verbalized their struggles. And I conclude that people who believe that they have or they had a chemical imbalance, that's why they took the drug, those have a really harder time to stop taking the drugs. No matter how well, carefully they follow a technical protocol, a gradual decrease, giving their brain and themselves time between changes to readapt, to reestablish the balance, and then go on to the next step. Besides all these very basic but hard to apply principles, the notion that they have an imbalance and so they will need that sort of remedy in the future, they will need it. It makes it very difficult for them to let go.
And what's the story they could, or what's the story that we could replace that with?
Okay.
The golden question.
It's the most difficult question because there is no equivalent simple story. That's why I call it an archetype. It's so durable, it's so lasting. So the equivalent, the alternatives are critical thinking about how people change and how, about what we call the placebo effect and the expectations and the relationship with the person who prescribes you, and the fact that you are in a culture that you've accepted this idea as completely normal and natural, and it's kind of in you now, and you're transmitting it left, right, and center yourself. So that's the idea that it's literally looking at the history of the idea. It's looking at the power behind the people who push the idea and the lack of power behind those who often accept the idea. Mm-hmm. And it's looking at how does that idea mesh with your values as a person? What does it imply? What does it mean? Is that the person you want to be, or is that the person you just think you are because that's what you learned? Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by critical thinking. It's something that has to be tackled by a critical approach. Find the history of this so that you look at the sociology of it, look at the politics of it, look at the morality of it, and then you've undermined it. But there's no shortcut, is what I'm saying. Mm. There's no shortcut to being a social human being who thinks for themselves. There's no shortcut. So that is the task for you to withdraw from this drug, is to think for yourself. And here's the first idea you might want to tackle. Do you truly want to accept it, or do you want to see if there might be an alternative that you must discover? It's a big job, but I think some people do it. They outgrow the idea, they emancipate themselves from it, and then they move on. Hmm.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Time flies, and it's been so interesting listening to you.
It's very kind of you to say that. Thank you for inviting me on this, and thank you for your patience.
No patience needed. And